Se declara abierta la...
Good afternoon. The sixth plenary meeting of the substantive session of the United Nations Conference to negotiate a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons leading towards their total elimination is called to order.
La conferencia proseguirá ahora.
The conference will now continue its consideration of topic 2, core prohibitions, effective legal measures, legal provisions and norms under agenda item 8B. And we are currently having an exchange of views and hearing countries' views about what they feel should be the content of the treaty's provisions. So continuing with the list of speakers, I call first on the delegation of Iran.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, we believe that the scope of the instrument and the prohibitions should be as comprehensive as possible. It should complement all existing international legally binding instruments governing nuclear weapons. Moreover, it should have no loophole as exists, for instance, in the CTBT for such cases as the subcritical and similar experiments. Equally, contrary to such a discriminatory treaty as the NPT, it must be non-discriminatory. We have to avoid developing again an NPT-like discriminatory treaty that divides its parties to nuclear weapon haves and have-nots. It is also discriminatory as it has a robust mechanism for the verification of compliance of non-nuclear weapon states with their obligations under the treaty, but lacks any mechanism to verify the compliance of nuclear weapon states with their nuclear disarmament obligations. Implementation of prohibitions contained in the future instrument and the elimination of nuclear weapons, related fissile material, and nuclear weapon construction facilities should be time-bound. We should seriously avoid leaving the implementation of such important provisions for an unseeable future, as it is in the case of Article 6 of the NPT. Such an instrument in no way should legitimize the existence of nuclear weapons or their continued possession. Its text should be clear, precise, and resistant against abuse and any interpretation contrary to its object and purpose and the general objective of a world without nuclear weapons. It should unambiguously and categorically prohibit forever, without exception and under any circumstances whatsoever, research on and the development, testing, production, possession, acquisition, transfer, receipt, storage, installation, deployment, stockpiling, modernizing, qualitative improvement, and use or threat of use of all types of nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices. The same sort of prohibition shall apply to the production, possession, acquisition, transfer, and stockpiling of any amount of fissile materials for use in nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices. Prohibition should also cover construction of any nuclear weapon-related installations. Moreover, it shall prohibit any kind of direct or indirect cooperation in, or assistance to, or encouragement or inducement of any activity prohibited under the Convention, or incompatible with its object and purpose, or the general objective of a nuclear weapon-free world. It should set a clear and unextendable deadline for the total elimination of nuclear weapons, complete destruction of all weapon-grade fissile material, or their conversion to material usable for peaceful purposes, and the total destruction of nuclear weapon-related facilities, or, if feasible, their conversion to uses not incompatible with the provisions and objects of and purpose of the instrument. Likewise, it has to establish a robust international verification mechanism to ensure compliance of its parties with their obligations thereunder, and also ensure the principle of irreversibility. Finally, Madam President, it shall in no way affect the fullest possible realization of the inalienable right of states to develop, research, production, and use of nuclear energy for peaceful purposes without discrimination. And I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the distinguished delegate of Iran for his intervention. I give the floor to the delegation of Nigeria.
Thank you, Madam President, for giving us the floor. As my delegation has successfully maintained, the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of the use of nuclear weapons make it unacceptable for such weapons to exist in human societies. Pursuant to the obligations as contained in Article 6 of the NPT to pursue negotiations in good faith on effective measures leading to the cessation of the nuclear arms race at an early date and to nuclear disarmament, the world has been waiting for 47 years without any appreciable progress made with regard to this obligation. Nuclear weapons are not for fun. They are for use. Their manufacture and stockpiling are a pointer to an intendment to use them. And in fact, they have been used in the past, and the world saw the devastating effect of their use, not only to humans, but to the ecosystem. My delegation agrees with the position of other delegations on the necessity of a legally binding international instrument that prohibits nuclear weapons. Their prohibition has the potential to codify their illegality, stigmatize their possession, and facilitate their eventual elimination. This delegation also agrees that banning of nuclear weapons will put the weapons on same footing as the other recognized weapons of mass destruction, such as biological and chemical weapons. A treaty banning nuclear weapons should build on existing norms and reinforce existing legal instruments, notably obligations under Article 4 as earlier stated. With regard to core prohibitions of the treaty, the fulcrum should include the prohibition of its parties, their nationals, and any other individual subject to its jurisdiction from engaging in any activity related to the use, development, production, stockpiling, transfer, acquisition, deployment, testing, and financing of nuclear weapons, as well as assistance with these acts under any circumstance. It should also provide a framework for the elimination of nuclear weapons within agreed timeframes for those states with nuclear weapons that will become states parties. The treaty should also prohibit state parties from allowing nuclear weapons to be stationed on a territory under their control. The treaty should prohibit the assistance, encouragement, or inducement of any nuclear weapon-related activities, including specifically through financing. The treaty should prohibit the transit and transshipment of nuclear weapons through the territories of state parties. The text should be precise, concise, simple, and unambiguous. Finally, the treaty should have provisions for verification measures that will ensure the effective maintenance of a nuclear-free world and to achieve nuclear disarmament. The verification measures should extend to elimination of nuclear weapons. In other words, the treaty should provide for the time-bound, transparent, verifiable, and irreversible elimination of nuclear weapons. I thank you, Madam President.
Le agradezco al distinguido.
I thank the distinguished representative of Nigeria for his statement. The representative of Egypt has the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. My delegation believes that a new legally binding instrument prohibiting nuclear weapons leading towards their total elimination should include the following legal measures and provisions. First, it should prohibit the use, development, production, stockpiling, transfer, possession, and deployment of nuclear weapons within the jurisdiction of its territories. It should also prohibit the transit and stationing of nuclear weapons within its territories and forbid assistance with these acts under any circumstances. It should prohibit the use or threat of use of nuclear weapons and refer unequivocally to the incompatibility of nuclear weapons with the principles and norms of international humanitarian law. Second, it should stipulate that each state party undertakes to destroy nuclear weapons it owns or possesses that are located under its jurisdiction or control, and destroy or divert to peaceful purposes fissile material produced for nuclear weapons. It should call for the establishment of a nuclear weapon-free zone to contribute in creating a world free of nuclear weapons and the maintenance of regional and international peace and security. The new instrument should emphasize the exceptional importance of establishing nuclear weapon-free zones in volatile areas and where nuclear facilities are not subject to comprehensive safeguards by the IAEA. Fifth, it should reject any role for nuclear weapons in security, defense, and strategic doctrines and undermine the concept of nuclear deterrence. And sixth, it should include provisions that address the importance of verification in nuclear disarmament to ensure accountability for the total elimination of nuclear weapon stockpiles and the irreversible removal of fissile material. It should stipulate that nuclear disarmament should be accompanied with an effective verification regime that ensures compliance with its legal commitments. I thank you, Madam President.
Le agradezco al distinguido.
I thank the distinguished representative of Egypt for his statement, and I call now on the representative of Ireland.
Madam President, I do not propose to speak at great length at this time, as I believe that many of the points that my delegation wishes to make in this segment have been well covered by other delegations here this morning and earlier this afternoon. You've invited us to discuss core prohibitions in this session, and my delegation will speak later on a number of other issues. To begin with some general points, as my delegation has stressed in our interventions so far, we are working here on the production of a credible legal instrument. It must be feasible to implement and to ensure its compliance. We believe that we should follow existing models that we have available to us from other weapons prohibitions treaties in as much as possible, especially those other instruments prohibiting other weapons of mass destruction. And as many delegates have said, there is no need for us to reinvent the wheel. We are talking here about a weapon, and it is high time to treat it as such. And as we have already said, we should focus on the weapon and not on the actor. We have heard and also agree with the ideas expressed here of a lean but robust treaty. In terms of specific core prohibitions, let me preface my proposals by clarifying that they are just that, are proposals, and that we will continue to consult and review within our own systems on this very important issue, as I believe many of us will do after this very valuable initial week of exchanges. For I think we are also here to listen to the proposals and ideas raised by all other delegations, and to absorb and learn from the advice and expertise available to us from the range of experts here and from the working papers which have already been submitted, as well as your own guidance to us as President. That said, at this point, based on our mandate from the resolution and based on the examples from other weapons treaties, we would wish to see prohibitions on the following: possession, use, development, production, acquisition, stockpiling, retention, and transfer. In terms of testing, our understanding is that development could also encompass testing, and that this would include computer-simulated testing. But this may be one of the issues that we can explore further later in our discussions. We have taken the view that the term develop in the context of weapons prohibitions is widely interpreted as capturing design, testing and production, and indeed anything required to bring a weapon into existence and operation. Computer simulations are clearly a type of testing, and therefore in our view would be prohibited under the prohibition on development. We want to fully acknowledge the key role of the CTBT and of the CTBTO, which we have no desire to supplant in any way, and which we believe can be made very clear in the preamble. But we do have some concerns that to omit a specific prohibition on testing in the new treaty could leave the danger of a loophole, and many delegations have spoken of the importance of ensuring no loopholes in this treaty. Rather, by including the reference, we can also reinforce and strengthen the important norm created by the CTBT until its entry into force. We would also wish to see prohibitions on assistance, encouragement and inducement of anyone to engage in any activity prohibited to a state party under this treaty. On assistance, our understanding is that this could also encompass financing. But again, this is something we would wish to hear more about, and we would be interested to hear more on this in exchanges with delegates. We have previously taken the view in other treaties that finance does represent assistance when done by or on behalf of the state, and this has implications for the regulation of the investment of our public monies. On stockpiles, we understand the treaty is not aimed at addressing stockpile destruction or verification of same at this time. However, the elimination of their nuclear arsenals will have to be a requirement for those with nuclear weapons who want to accede to this treaty. Like the cluster munitions and anti-personnel mines and chemical weapons conventions, this treaty will be a hybrid humanitarian law disarmament instrument. The prohibition on the use of the weapon has its basis in the IHL rule prohibiting indiscriminate weapons, while stockpile destruction is a disarmament measure intended to ensure that the prohibited weapon cannot be used in breach of the prohibition. Stockpile destruction brings with it reporting requirements and a very extensive inspection, monitoring and enforcement regime. Such arrangements for nuclear weapons could add considerable complexity and length to our negotiations. However, to omit any reference to stockpiles would send a very damaging signal. We need to be very clear that any state with nuclear weapons that wants to join this treaty will need to eliminate their nuclear weapons. We suggest a possible provision that states parties that possess nuclear weapons who wish to accede to the new treaty will have to provide a statement of their current stockpile, as well as a proposed time-bound plan and framework for the removal of the weapons from operational stockpiles and their destruction, including the safety and environmental standards that will apply and the proposed verification measures to be applied. And, like many other delegates have said, this process could be the subject of an additional protocol or other agreement with states parties to the treaty. To conclude, we are interested to hear and to consult with delegates further on these and on all other issues, and we look forward very much to our continuing exchanges on these important matters. Thank you.
Le agradezco a la distinguida.
I thank the distinguished representative of Ireland for her statement. Switzerland has the floor now.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Like other delegations this morning and early this afternoon, Switzerland is of the view that the treaty should contain at its core a number of key prohibitions. Many of these prohibitions have already been referenced numerous times, but let me just list which prohibitions the treaty should focus on. Development, production, acquisition, possession and stockpiling, transfer and use. However, like a number of other delegations, we consider that we should not include a prohibition concerning the threat of use of nuclear weapons. The UN Charter clearly regulates the prohibition of the use of force in a general way, this covering all types of weapons. A new provision could undermine the existing prohibition and scope as contained in Article 2 of the UN Charter. Testing, on the other hand, should figure among the activities prohibited to any state party. Here, it is important that we do not create an alternative norm to the one established by the CTBT. If we were to do this, we would undermine the existing nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation regime. We would undermine efforts to have the CTBT ratified and entered into force by saying that the CTBT is not a norm sufficiently strong. Consequently, the ban treaty should spell out what states parties should not do in terms of testing in accordance with the CTBT. We can here rely on textual elements found in some nuclear weapons-free zone treaties. In addition to prohibitions, the treaty could also contain certain positive obligations. A number of options could be pursued, including victim assistance, assistance in clearing efforts after nuclear detonation, or ensuring international cooperation and assistance with regard to nuclear protection. Beyond this list of core obligations, let me flag a related issue that will deserve close attention. The ban treaty could create an important and strong norm at the international level. It could create a norm that contains broader prohibitions than the NPT. It will hence be important that this norm be backed by verification measures. Assurances should be provided in the form of verification that the commitments made under the treaty are respected and implemented. This will also be necessary to avoid that we create an instrument that may be considered as a possible alternative to the NPT, but without providing the necessary reassurances. We do not have to reinvent the wheel here or establish a new and costly verification mechanism. We can rely on the IAEA and its safeguards activities. What we will have to decide is which verification instruments developed by the IAEA should be implemented by states parties. We would be of the view that the verification system under the ban treaty should rely on the highest verification standards developed by the IAEA. Also, let me underline that what I'm suggesting is nothing special or out of the ordinary. Concluding with the IAEA in bringing into force a safeguards agreement is a requirement spelled out in some, if not in all, nuclear weapon-free zones treaty have followed. Last element that I would like to flag at this stage is that we will need to be very careful in crafting these prohibitions. These prohibitions should not hamper key prerogatives of rights of states. They should not constrain the right to the peaceful use of nuclear energy. Also, they should not impact key economic, industrial, or research interests. The treaty should not impact cooperation in the field of NRBC protection. Similarly, the treaty should not impede or constrain security and military cooperation with states not parties when this cooperation is not in contradiction with the purpose and object of the treaty. Safeguarding rights in these four domains, that is, peaceful use of nuclear energy, economy and trade, NRBC, as well as security and military cooperation, will be essential for the treaty to be supported by the greatest possible number of states. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Le agradezco a la distinguida.
I thank the distinguished representative of Switzerland for that statement. I call now on the representative of Argentina.
Gracias, señora presidenta.
Thank you very much, Madam President. First of all, may I congratulate you on the way you are guiding the work of this conference. I assure you of the full cooperation of the Argentine delegation. My delegation, in addressing topic 2, core prohibitions, effective legal measures, legal provisions and norms, we would like to say what should be the core of this treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons, leading to their total elimination. The treaty should contain all of the elements that have been mandated to us, provisions not only to prohibit nuclear weapons, but also provisions to enable us to move towards total elimination and in a verifiable way, given the humanitarian consequences. And so we would like to stress the need for effective provisions on nuclear weapons. We shouldn't just have provisions on the scope of the threat, the use, the design, production, etc., but we should also include other elements such as how to cope with fissile materials, verification, and so forth. Because we must be cautious when we conclude such a treaty, because we need to have all the elements recommended in the resolution, and we are negotiating here. If there is no verification, then in practical terms, it is a purely symbolic political statement. Under Article 3 of the NPT, action has been taken on the basis of mandatory provisions and very strict provisions. We have to keep the balance between the 3 pillars of the NPT and see how we can approach this as a whole. So we believe we must include measures to strengthen the NPT, and this was seen in the general debate, particularly Article 6, which, after all, talks about a nuclear weapon-free world in seeking general and complete disarmament. And also, it refers to the elimination of such weapons in the future. So we propose a future treaty complement and strengthen the NPT. We would also have to have a statement that all the states parties would abide by the commitments they have made under the NPT and the CTBT. The governing board of the IAEA and the Security Council have a responsibility vis-à-vis compliance with the NPT. One cannot say that a member of our treaty is not necessarily also a member of the NPT. We have to also ensure that the CBTB enters into force very soon. Thank you very much, Madam.
Le agradezco a la distinguida
I thank the distinguished representative of Argentina for her statement, and I call now on Antigua and Barbuda.
Good afternoon, Madam President. Thank you for the opportunity to take the floor, and I would like to speak on behalf of the 14 member states of the Caribbean Community, CARICOM. Madam President, CARICOM would like to contribute to this important discussion on the core prohibitions of this very important treaty as we work towards ensuring a world free of nuclear weapons. We would like to see the broad application of the following core prohibitions that will be applied to all states parties to the treaty without discrimination: possession, production, acquisition, stockpiling, development, testing, transfer and transit, deployment, financing the use or possession of nuclear weapons, and also encouraging or assisting or inciting to engage of any one of the other prohibited uses. Madam President, the case for the nuclear weapons ban treaty has been driven by serious concerns regarding the humanitarian consequences of nuclear detonation. As a result, CARICOM calls for the operative part of the treaty to include positive provisions that address human and environmental harms, recognize rights, and offer remedial measures to victims. These provisions should include environmental remediation, risk education, victim and survivor assistance, and stockpile destruction. Nuclear weapons are a threat to humankind that knows no borders, and they threaten not only the countries that possess them, but the entire planet. Hence, their prohibition is an imperative of global security. In order for a treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons to be effective in leading towards their total and complete elimination, its core prohibitions must be clear, robust, and ample. In this sense, we can learn from the experience of other legal instruments, such as our own regional experience with a prohibition of nuclear weapons with the Treaty of Tlatelolco, of which CARICOM states are proud members. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Antigua and Barbuda on behalf of the CARICOM region. And now I give the floor to the delegation of Jamaica.
Madam President, my delegation aligns itself with the statement delivered by Antigua and Barbuda on behalf of CARICOM states. I take the floor to highlight issues which we believe should be taken into account in today's consideration of core prohibitions, effective legal measures, and legal provisions and norms. We view the scope as the foundation on which we will seek to develop a robust treaty. Indeed, our approach to the core prohibitions will have a strong bearing on the normative framework of the treaty and its ability to effectively establish a universal norm against the possession and use of nuclear weapons. This will serve to stigmatize such weapons and discourage their horizontal and vertical proliferation. In terms of core prohibitions, Jamaica advocates a broad scope for the treaty. For my delegation, it is therefore imperative that the core prohibitions of this treaty not be limited to the use or threat of use of nuclear weapons. Instead, the treaty should also prohibit the possession, retention, development, production, testing, acquisition, stockpiling, transit, transfer, transshipment, stationing, deployment, and financing of nuclear weapons. Other core prohibitions that should be addressed in the treaty includes the prohibition on assistance in the commission of prohibited acts and encouragement or inducement to pursue prohibited activities. As my delegation said yesterday, one of the key objectives of the treaty is to close the legal gap and address the ambiguity in nuclear governance. This requires that we build on the prohibitions contained in existing instruments. In this connection, the elements for a comprehensive prohibition of nuclear weapons could be drawn from the Nuclear Weapon Free Zone treaties and the Biological and Chemical Weapons Conventions. In this regard, we note the very useful working paper submitted by OPANAL to the OEWG in May 2016. A further point for consideration is that the prohibitions in the treaty should apply to states parties, their nationals, and any individuals subject to their jurisdiction. Finally, Madam President, we also support the recognition of victims' rights. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Jamaica, Ambassador, Permanent Representative of Jamaica, for his contribution. And now I give the floor to the delegation of Bangladesh. They are not present in the room at this moment. The delegation of Trinidad and Tobago has the floor.
My delegation associates itself with the statement delivered by Antigua and Barbuda on behalf of CARICOM, and we are pleased to submit our perspectives on topic 2, core prohibitions. which we view as the nucleus of this treaty. As highlighted in my delegation's opening statement during the high-level segment, Trinidad and Tobago reiterates that a set of core prohibitions will be effective in achieving the purposes of a treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons leading to their total elimination. Like other states that have spoken, my country is of the view that the core prohibitions in this treaty must build on existing legal frameworks and strengthen existing treaties such as the NPT, the CTBT, and nuclear weapon-free zone treaties. In this light, my delegation contemplates the following core prohibitions in the treaty as highlighted by CARICOM and other speakers. Firstly, stockpiling, possession, and use must be prohibited by all states without discrimination. We also submit that the deployment of nuclear weapons must also be prohibited. Prohibitions on acquisition, transfer, and control, which prohibits any bilateral or alliance-based arrangement involving the acquisition or transfer of nuclear weapons, should also be a prohibition. Development and production, we advocate that a comprehensive prohibition on all development-related activities must be included if we want the highest standards for this treaty, and testing should also be explicitly prohibited. Assistance and financing, and my delegation calls for a prohibition on assisting, financing, and encouraging prohibited acts. We also believe the treaty should include positive obligations for states parties, such as ensuring the rights of victims and survivors of nuclear weapons activities and repairing the damage to affected environments. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished delegate from Trinidad and Tobago. We have exhausted the list of...
New Zealand?
Teníamos un cambio de...
We had a change in the order of the list of speakers. And so the last request for the floor is from New Zealand. New Zealand has the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam President. New Zealand is pleased now to join the discussion on the second topic you have set for our meeting this week, an exploration of the core prohibitions, effective legal measures, legal provisions and norms, which will form part of our treaty. The first point I would wish to make, Madam President, is indeed one which New Zealand has made on a number of occasions previously when speaking on this issue, and that is that our new treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons can in no way, as a matter of international law, undermine the NPT. Indeed, the prohibitions in our new treaty will serve to complement the fundamental obligations we have assumed under the NPT and to reinforce them. In some cases, this is simply on the basis of the repetition and reaffirmation in the new treaty of obligations already assumed by non-nuclear weapon states under the NPT, and in other cases, this will be pursuant to the new treaties making explicit a number of prohibitions on us which were in fact left implicit in the NPT. Their explicit inclusion in our new instrument will serve not only to complement but to strengthen and reinforce a number of the obligations relating to non-proliferation in the NPT. Secondly, it is imperative that our new instrument be clear as to its meaning and comprehensive in its scope. We must not, by the omission of any key nuclear weapon development-related activities, seem to create any ambiguity or leave open any possible gap in its coverage. This is certainly important as a matter of law, but equally, both in practical as well as presentational terms, we would not wish to send a signal that there might be any loophole in our range of prohibited activities. In our view, then, this means that we must be explicit in foreclosing the legal possibility of testing, possession, use, transfer, and stationing of nuclear weapons. Additional prohibited activities should mirror the full range, including development, acquisition, production, transfer, etc., typically found in prohibition-related treaties. We must include as well, of course, an explicit prohibition on the ancillary assistance-related activities, including encouragement and inducement in any way, which are also a usual feature of these types of treaties. In New Zealand's case, our domestic legislation, our Nuclear Free Zone Disarmament and Arms Control Act, prohibits activities which aid, abet, or procure the primary nuclear weapon-related prohibitions. We will be interested in hearing the views of colleagues here as to whether a prohibition on direct investment in nuclear weapon production should be explicitly included within our treaty, for instance, as part of the prohibition on assistance-related activities. Madam President, New Zealand will subsequently have more detailed comments to make regarding the span of the prohibitions to be included in the treaty, including as we develop its specific drafting. For now, we are particularly interested in listening to the views of colleagues as to whether adherence by nuclear weapon possessors should be facilitated within the framing of our present treaty, for instance, by including within its terms the ability of a state with nuclear weapons to adhere to the treaty on the basis, inter alia, of an undertaking to destroy its weapons, for example, within a given time frame, or whether this should be achieved only via the negotiation of a separate and specific regime. As I say, Madam President, we're very interested to exchange views on this issue. Thank you very much.
Le agradezco a la distinguida representante.
I thank the distinguished representative of New Zealand. And now we have the representative of Bangladesh, on whom I now call.
Thank you, Madam President. We are extremely grateful to you for allowing us this opportunity, and we apologize for the inconvenience caused due to our absence as we were caught up in another meeting. Madam President, Bangladesh believes that the issue of core prohibitions constitute the crux of the proposed international legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons, leading towards their total elimination. We therefore join other delegations in emphasizing that the core prohibitions in the instrument must be clear and unambiguous, and preferably leave no room for varied interpretations. This instrument is perhaps a historic opportunity to address various legal anomalies or gaps that characterize other international legal instruments prohibiting weapons of mass destruction as well as certain conventional weapons. In view of the catastrophic consequences of nuclear weapons, the core prohibitions should be broad-based, universal, and aspirational in nature, and should steer clear of any temporal considerations or arrangements in course of the negotiation process. We need to remain mindful that the more attenuating provisions added to the legal instrument, the more chances there would be to create justification for the status quo or the progressive steps preferred by a number of critical players. As we have stated in our statement at the high-level segment, we would underscore the importance of the proposed instrument prohibiting the use and threat of use, development, testing, production, possession, stockpiling, transfer, transit, and deployment of nuclear weapons. We remain cognizant that each of these terms deserves to be carefully studied in the context of international law, and their implication in relation to the proposed instrument duly understood and acknowledged by all concerned. We believe the proposed instrument needs to encompass all these elements pursuant to international humanitarian law that would deem all these to be in violation of the principles of distinction, precaution, and proportionality. The understanding reached in other disarmament treaties should be an important guide for our negotiations, but need not necessarily restrict the scope of the proposed instrument by way of precedent that need to be considered only in their respective contexts. Bangladesh would join other delegations in stipulating that the proposed instrument also prohibit assisting and financing, as well as encouraging and inducing the prohibited acts by state parties to the instrument, their nationals and other individuals under their respective jurisdictions. The proscription of such acts should also dispel any possibilities for unwarranted interpretation or equivocation. In addition to prohibition, the proposed instrument should contain a number of positive obligations by the state parties premised on international cooperation and assistance, including for national compliance and reporting, victim assistance, and environmental and health impact mitigation and remediation, among others. Any relevant safeguard and transparency measures should be practical and feasible and avoid creating onerous obligations for potential state parties at various levels of capacity and expertise. To conclude, we take note of the various constructive suggestions that had emanated from these discussions, and we look forward to engaging with other delegations for further discussions on those issues in the coming days. I thank you, Madam President.
Le agradezco al distinguido
I thank the distinguished representative of Bangladesh for his statement. So we have now come to the end of the list of representatives who'd asked for the floor. I'd like to thank you all for your contributions, very useful contributions about the prohibitions. And as we come to the end of the list of speakers, we will come to the NGOs on whom we shall now call. We are a little ahead of ourselves today, but if you agree, we could give civil society and academia a little more time to share with the conference what they have been studying in connection with this. So if you agree that we proceed in that way, then we will have some speakers from civil society, and they will make contributions to our discussion on this topic. So I shall call on Ms. Thea Kitchen.
Melstad, the Norwegian People's Aid Solidarity Youth.
Madam President, I speak on behalf of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, and its partner organization, Norwegian People's Aid Solidarity Youth. The community of nations must fully seize this historic opportunity to establish an unambiguous, comprehensive, global prohibition on the very worst weapons of mass destruction. Our task is of utmost urgency and importance. We are confident, based on past experience with other inherently indiscriminate, inhumane weapons, that this will prove a vital step in our quest to eradicate this ultimate menace from Earth. ICAN believes that the treaty should prohibit its parties from engaging in such activities as the development, production, testing, acquisition, stockpiling, transfer, development, and the use and threat of use of nuclear weapons. It should also prohibit its parties from assisting, financing, encouraging, and inducing such activities. We must fill the legal gap completely. We must ban these weapons categorically. This will be essential if we are to establish an effective global norm and powerful stigma against these horrific weapons. No party to the treaty should be permitted to maintain nuclear weapons on its territory or engage in preparations for their use. All parties must fully reject any role for nuclear weapons in their military arrangements. Let us be clear, this is not a treaty to entrench the status quo. This is a treaty to compel positive change. Without change, we will, to quote Einstein, drift towards unparalleled catastrophe. Our task is to develop the highest possible legal standard against these planet-endangering devices. We must leave no room for uncertainty about their illegality. As Itsuko Thurlow, the Hiroshima survivor, said yesterday, states must declare in no uncertain terms that these weapons are illegitimate, immoral, and illegal. We should all be confident that change is possible. We can already see many cracks in the nuclear edifice, and those cracks are widening and deepening as we pursue this treaty. People in parliaments around the world are demanding an end to their nation's reliance on nuclear weapons. Major political parties in nuclear-reliant nations are leading their full support to this historic process. We are confident that, in time, as the membership of this new treaty grows, we can compel these states to join. The pressure from the public and the international community to conform the new global norm will be too great to bear. They will see the merits of liberating themselves and the world of these weapons. It would be a grave error to establish anything less than a categorical prohibition. Distinguished delegates, I can also believe that the treaty must contain a legal obligation to destroy nuclear stockpiles and establish a framework to achieve their total elimination. Merely referencing elimination in the preamble would be entirely unsatisfactory from our perspective. Having said that, detailed provisions for the verified destruction of nuclear stockpiles need not to be negotiated at this stage. A simple obligation to destroy nuclear stockpiles would be sufficient. Parties to the treaty could agree to relevant measures and timelines as part of the implementation process through protocols or other appropriate legal instruments. We also believe that the treaty should include an obligation to ensure the full realization of the rights of victims of nuclear weapons. And it should include an obligation to ensure the rehabilitation to the greatest extent as possible of environments affected by nuclear detonations. Such provisions need not to be overly complicated. They certainly need not prolong this negotiation process. These are our general views on the core prohibitions and positive obligations to be included in the treaty. Distinguished delegates, as you may have observed, many youth from around the world are participating in this landmark conference. We are eager to raise public awareness globally about the negotiations taking place, and we want to exert the greatest possible pressure on our governments to support this treaty. On Twitter last night, the former US Secretary of Defense, William Perry, commended us for our efforts. He said, "It is encouraging to see the next generation engaging with their nuclear legacy. Where we go from here is in your hands." On behalf of Norwegian People's Aid Solidarity Youth, let me conclude by conveying our deepest regret, indeed our outrage, that the Norwegian government has chosen to boycott this major diplomatic conference. This is the most significant and promising initiative in our lifetime to advance the goal of a nuclear weapon-free world. It is a great travesty that Norway is absent. I wish to assure the delegates here today that the Norwegian people and the Norwegian Parliament firmly support this process and the goal of a total ban on nuclear weapons. So too do the people and parliaments of many other countries that are boycotting this process. If our democracies were truly effective, these horrific weapons of mass destruction would not exist. We will continue to do our bit to address this democratic deficit. We will continue to speak up as youth for a safer, saner world, free from the threat of radioactive incineration. I thank you.
I thank Ms. Tia Catherine Melstad from Norwegian People Said Solidarity Youth. And I give the floor to Ms. Susie Snyder from PAX.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Madam Chair, for the opportunity to speak. In examining what should be included in the core prohibitions of this treaty, the operative paragraphs, PAX has some recommendations. The new treaty should comprehensively prohibit activities related to making, getting, having, using nuclear weapons, as well as outlaw any assistance of those prohibited acts. In other words, activities like development, production, testing, acquisition, stockpile, transfer, retention, deployment, or use of nuclear weapons need to be banned. Logically, it flows that helping to do these prohibited acts through assistance, investment, encouragement, or inducement should, of course, also be prohibited. I will focus my remarks on the issue of assistance, as understandings around assistance are shaping the impact of treaties and helping to build the norms that give weight to these discussions. It is important to reinforce the prohibition on assistance by including an explicit reference to investment or financing. The main benefit is making explicit the growing understanding in international law that financing constitutes a form of assistance. Including a ban on financing was already suggested in the final report of the Open-Ended Working Group. Now, financial institutions make their own judgments, but they look to governments to provide clarity on what constitutes unethical investment. Our research shows that many financial institutions refer to the Non-Proliferation Treaty as a justification for the exclusion of nuclear weapon producers. However, a significant number also refer to the NPT to argue that nuclear weapons are not comprehensively prohibited and therefore still a legitimate investment. The inclusion of a prohibition on financing in a new treaty banning nuclear weapons will make it clear that the nuclear weapon business is not legitimate, just as nuclear weapons are not legitimate. Including a specific prohibition on the financing of prohibited acts in this ban treaty is in line with the vision driving the treaty to codify the illegitimacy of nuclear weapons. We will be able to limit the flow of financing to the companies involved in nuclear arsenals and thereby have a concrete impact beyond the countries that initially accede to the treaty. We will also be able to provide clarity to financial institutions and stimulate the strengthening of existing policies and practices in acceding countries. The International Convention for the Suppression of the Financing of Terrorism is built on the recognition of the idea that financing provides a crucial form of assistance. This convention has been a guideline for some states to adopt national legislation implementing the Convention on Cluster Munitions, and specifically include prohibitions on financing of cluster munition producers in that legislation. This illustrates this growing understanding that financing is a part of assistance, and that if assistance with certain acts is to be banned, so should that financing. We're seeking to build on the interpretation of other weapons prohibitions, as well as to provide clarity and guidance to the investment community. The Convention on Cluster Munitions prohibits the assistance, encouragement, or inducement of anyone to engage in prohibited activities. The International Convention for the Suppression of Financing of Terrorism goes further by not only prohibiting the provision of funds to anyone, but also by anyone. Adopting similar language in a nuclear weapon treaty could therefore prohibit its parties, their nationals, and any other individuals or entities subject to their jurisdiction from the assistance, encouragement, inducement, or investment in acts prohibited by the treaty. As the colleague from Nigeria has said, this treaty should be precise, concise, simple, and unambiguous. And as our colleague from Ireland said, it needs to be lean but robust. Colleagues, this is an opportunity to increase the robustness of this treaty, and we've prepared a working paper on the issue available on the Secretariat website, ACONF 299/217 NGO/WP5. Thank you very much.
I thank Ms. Susie Snyder from PACS. And now I give the floor to Ms. Elizabeth Minor from Article 36.
Thank you, President. The testimony given by survivors of nuclear detonations to this conference has emphasised why this treaty to categorically prohibit nuclear weapons must be negotiated. The horrific and devastating impacts of nuclear weapons on people and places renders the possession of these weapons fundamentally unacceptable. The treaty should reflect and build on previous instruments that address the humanitarian impact of weapons systems whose effects have also been deemed unacceptable by the international community. It should at least include clear prohibitions on the use, development including testing, production, acquisition, stockpiling, retention, and transfer of nuclear weapons. It should also include prohibitions on the assistance, financing, encouragement, or inducement of prohibited acts. Using the language of established weapons prohibition treaties as a basis will help to make the terms of this treaty hard to criticise for any who choose at first to stand outside it. The treaty should not allow states parties to continue in arrangements whereby nuclear weapons are maintained on their territory, or agreements for the use of nuclear weapons on states parties' behalf. It is also key that the treaty includes a clear obligation to complete the destruction of any stockpiled nuclear weapons as soon as possible, safely and in an environmentally appropriate manner. The treaty need not specify the details of this process, but it should provide a clear framework under which any state with nuclear weapons, upon accession to the treaty, would come under an obligation to destroy their entire stockpile as soon as possible and according to a time-bound plan. This would reflect the form of previous treaties that prohibit unacceptable weapons and seek to move towards the destruction of all stockpiles. The treaty should also include other positive obligations requiring actions from state parties. The treaty should address human and environmental harms caused by nuclear weapons in its operative section. This is fundamentally important to the principles on which the treaty is based and to responding to the humanitarian imperative that informs it. The rights of victims of nuclear weapons have not yet been adequately addressed. Obligations on states parties for the remediation of environments contaminated by the use of nuclear weapons, including in testing, and the provision of assistance to victims under states parties' jurisdictions should be included in the treaty. This would affirm the obligations of states to uphold and ensure the realization of the rights of their citizens and all those living in their territories. International cooperation and assistance provisions in the treaty, obliging all those in a position to do so to provide support that may include technical, material, or financial assistance, can help states parties to realize these obligations. As well as being essential given the core principles that inform this initiative, it is also vital that positive obligations are included in the treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons in order to not take a step back in the law of weapons prohibitions. Such provisions have been successfully included in previous treaties and progressively developed. These norms must be upheld, and these experiences can inform the formulation of this treaty's provisions. Article 36 has submitted a working paper to this conference, NGO Working Paper 10, which addresses these issues in more depth. Thank you, President.
I thank Ms. Elizabeth Minor from Article 36 for her contribution to this conference. Now I'll give the floor to Mr. Yasuyoshi Komiso of Mayors for Peace.
Thank you, Madam President. On behalf of Mayors for Peace, I am pleased to voice our strong support for this historic negotiation to legally prohibit nuclear weapons. Our international membership now includes over 7,200 member cities in 162 countries and regions, altogether representing more than 1 billion citizens. A legal prohibition of nuclear weapons would be a crucial step forward to create a turning point in efforts to achieve a world without nuclear weapons. I am very pleased to inform you that Mayor Frank Carney of Des Moines, Iowa, the leader of the 210 Mayors for Peace member cities in the United States, is with us today to show their solidarity and support for this historic negotiation. Mr. Kawani, please stand up. The atomic bomb survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, who have continued to call for the abolition of nuclear weapons, are anxiously looking forward to the successful outcome of this negotiation. Mayors for Peace has actively participated in the process leading to this historic negotiation. We have also long promoted a nuclear weapons convention, such as the model convention contained in UN document A/62/50. And we continue to support this approach. However, by attentively following recent discussions, we sense the growing majority of civil society activists and non-nuclear weapon states are supporting the ban treaty approach, which is widely viewed as urgently needed to revitalize global nuclear disarmament efforts. With this as the focus of these negotiations, we will support such an approach as we also continue to pursue comprehensive initiatives to complement ban treaty approach. As I understand it, unlike the proposal for nuclear weapons convention, the ban treaty approach focuses on establishing a legal prohibition, but leaves the verification and other aspects aside. Yet, the scope of this prohibition will be comprehensive and include, for example, development, production, testing, possession, stockpiling, deployment, transfer, as well as use and threat of use. It should apply indiscriminately and without reservation. To ensure the ban treaty approach will be successful, however, we need to consider certain challenges in the face of divisive positions among UN member states. As we have stated in Mayors for Peace open letter of March 14, 2017, in document A/229/2017/NGO/WP4, we must ensure that the negotiations will achieve the effective legal prohibition of nuclear weapons, leading to their total elimination. In my brief remarks today, extending from the open letter, I'll focus on this specific challenge of the ban treaty approach and present a proposal to ensure its success. Most of the states with nuclear weapons and their allies have objected to these negotiations. While they have not challenged the vision of the world without nuclear weapons, they continue to claim that security must be considered and that conditions for ban are not ripe. 35 states voted against Resolution 71/258, and most of them are likely to boycott the negotiations. A ban treaty ratified with more than 100 non-nuclear weapons states will not establish legally binding effects in general international law beyond the contracting parties, especially if it fails to include most of nuclear-dependent states. Judging from the history of nuclear disarmament, nuclear weapon states will not join a legal regime without verification. The same is likely true for the nuclear umbrella states. To address these concerns, we propose the following. First, while we make the prohibition tight and without reservations, an article or clause needs to be drafted to allow for the amplification of the treaty as its circumstances evolve. How specific this provision can be should be determined in the negotiation, but this clause should at least provide for the possibility of adding clauses at a later date covering such issues as verification, environmental protection, compensation, and other relevant subjects. These could be addressed as necessary to amplify effective implementation measures and to ensure wider participation in the treaty without risking the integrity of the core prohibitions. An article should provide practical conditions for the addition of articles or protocol. Second, a contracting party consultation mechanism should be put in place. This mechanism can be a part of the NPT review mechanism relating to Article 6 or a standalone mechanism specific to the banned treaty. Through such a mechanism, contracting parties could assess the status of the treaty, ways to promote more ratifications, and practical measures to amplify the treaty provisions and their effective implementation. Observer states and civil society partners should also be invited to participate. Lastly, civil society persuasion is indispensable. Since no states question the vision of the world without nuclear weapons, and given the widespread perception that nuclear deterrence is both irrelevant in settling current international security challenges, as well as a source of unacceptable risks of catastrophic effects if it fails, we view these facts as offering a solid foundation for engaging nuclear-dependent states to take a positive attitude towards nuclear weapons prohibition. We believe that our proposal can facilitate such changes. Working with its conscientious civil society partners, Mayors for Peace continues to encourage nuclear weapons possessor states and their allies to show the leadership necessary to advance towards a world without nuclear weapons. Together, we will continue our own efforts until this historic goal is finally achieved. Thank you, Madam Chair, President.
Le doy las gracias al señor Comiso.
I would like to thank Mr. Yasuyoshi Komiso from the Mayors for Peace. And I call now on Ms. Ray Aitchison,
the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam President. Thank you very much for this opportunity to address this conference. WILPF has prepared a paper on principles, prohibitions, and positive obligations of a treaty banning nuclear weapons. After listening closely to interventions from delegations this morning and this afternoon, I would like to comment on a few of the prohibitions and positive obligations. In order to be effective as a prohibition treaty that leads to the elimination of nuclear weapons, the core prohibitions should be as clear and comprehensive as possible. It should draw upon other treaties prohibiting weapons, but also needs to be mindful of the existing rules governing nuclear weapons, as well as specific and unique aspects of their development and deployment, and of the urgent need to challenge their current place in so-called security architecture, policies, and practices. From our perspective, the treaty should prohibit stockpiling, use and threat of use and planning for use, deployment, transfer, acquisition, and stationing, development and production, testing, transit and transshipment, and financing, assistance, encouragement, and inducement. I would like to elaborate on just a few of these. The ban treaty must prohibit the stockpiling of nuclear weapons. The most fundamental element of the Prohibition Treaty is perhaps that no state can join the treaty and possess nuclear weapons. The ban treaty itself does not need to set out provisions for elimination. It would only need to require that any state joining the treaty eliminate its nuclear weapons. The Chemical Weapons Convention, for example, specifies that states parties must undertake to destroy chemical weapons it owns or possesses, or that are located in any place under its jurisdiction or control. The provisions for the disarmament process, including timeframes and verification measures, could be negotiated when a nuclear-armed state renounces its nuclear weapons and accedes to the treaty. The ban treaty should also prohibit the use and the threat of use of nuclear weapons. There was some conversation about that earlier today. The threat of use is included in nuclear weapon-free zone treaties, of course. Other treaties banning specific weapons may not include threat of use, but it is a necessary element in a nuclear weapon ban treaty because the entire concept of nuclear deterrence relies on the threat of use and on the preparedness for such use. No state party to the ban treaty should be able to maintain a security policy that includes the threat of use of nuclear weapons. The treaty should also prohibit the testing of nuclear weapons. It is true that the CTBT prohibits testing by explosive means, but not by subcritical testing, computer modeling, or hydrodynamic trials. The Nuclear Weapon Ban Treaty should explicitly prohibit testing in order to reinforce and strengthen the norm created by the CTBT against nuclear weapon testing, to tighten the restrictions against all possible forms of testing, and to encourage states to uphold their current moratoriums against testing and or to inspire new such moratoriums. The issue of whether testing could be considered covered by development needs to be examined, as some nuclear-armed states categorize it separately in their national documents. The treaty should prohibit financing of nuclear weapons. The intervention from PUCs thoroughly covered this issue, but I also just wanted to note that there is already an obligation on non-state actors not to finance any WMD activities under UN Security Council Resolution 1540. A ban treaty could adopt this language and expand it to cover any such activities undertaken by states as well as non-state actors. A prohibition on assistance with prohibited acts should explicitly include a prohibition on any form of financial or material support to public and private enterprises involved in any of the activities prohibited by the treaty. The economic impacts on the nuclear weapon complex from such a prohibition would be significant. The ban treaty should prohibit the transit and transshipment of nuclear weapons to the territories of states parties. This was also something that came up this morning in various contexts. On the basis of national security and public safety, and as a matter of principle, the ban treaty should prohibit the stationing or transit or transshipment of nuclear weapons in states parties' territory, including in their airspace and territorial waters, or from allowing visits to their ports by foreign ships carrying nuclear weapons, or visits to their airfields by foreign aircraft carrying nuclear weapons. Any accident involving transiting nuclear weapons could have sudden and devastating consequences for local populations. This must be at the forefront in our consideration of this issue. Furthermore, if a transit or visitation occurs during a period of hostilities between nuclear-armed states, allowing transits could result in non-nuclear armed states being targeted with nuclear weapons. I also wanted to speak very briefly about some of the positive obligations we see as important for this treaty. It should recognize that victims and survivors of the use and testing of nuclear weapons have rights, as articulated in the development of international human rights law and other instruments prohibiting inhumane weapons, such as the treaties banning cluster munitions and anti-personnel landmines. The ban treaty should also recognize the rights of whistleblowers, those who may be contributing to our understanding of what is actually happening in states parties. The ban treaty should reflect the need to rehabilitate territories that have been contaminated as a result of activities related to the use, development, testing, production, transit, transshipment, or storage of nuclear weapons in their territory. And the treaty should also reflect an obligation to inform the public about the risks of nuclear weapons through a risk education provision. As a closing note, I would like to speak to the transformative potential of this treaty. This is our chance to change the way that nuclear weapons are treated, legally, politically, socially, and economically. We in civil society look forward to working with you to develop the strongest possible prohibition treaty. Thank you very much.
I thank Ms. Ray Aixons from Women's International League for Peace for her contribution to the discussion. I give the floor to Mr. John Burrows from Lawyers Committee on Nuclear Policy.
Madam President, let me first say that I am impressed by the sincerity and constructive spirit of the diplomats engaged in these negotiations. This morning, we heard some reasons advanced for not making the list of prohibited activities too extensive or too innovative. It was said that doing so could delay the negotiations and that it could be impractical for states to ensure that certain activities were not carried out in areas under their jurisdiction and control. I want to underline that there nonetheless is a strong case for including such activities as research, design, and testing among prohibited activities. First, the ban treaty will set a standard for the world and for individuals. It is not only about states. It will be important for young people and scientists to see that the treaty is very clear about not engaging in any nuclear weapons-related work. Sri Lanka this morning referred to the late Judge Weeramantra. He wrote a seminal book in the 1980s. It was entitled Nuclear Weapons and Scientific Responsibility. I am sure that he would support setting a standard for no research, no design. A second reason to include such activities as research, design, and testing among prohibited activities is that specificity will clarify what activities states must not allow that contribute to or assist with nuclear weapons work. Third, specificity will help to turn a spotlight on activities that at a minimum need close scrutiny. To give you just one example, there could be many. Laser fusion facilities in the United States and France are described as advancing basic science and energy research, but they are funded in good part because of their potential contribution to modeling nuclear explosions. Whether individuals from banned treaty members may participate in such work deserves attention and limitations at the very least. Fourth, the Prohibition Treaty will help set the template for future disarmament agreements and also may serve as the foundation for denuclearization by states now possessing nuclear arms. As to such states, the more specificity, the better. On another subject, this morning we heard different views expressed about whether a prohibition of threat of use should be included. As set out in the discussion paper of IALANA, the International Association of Lawyers Against Nuclear Arms, which is in the back of the room, IALANA comes down very strongly on the side of including the prohibition of threat of use. It is true that there is no prohibition of threatened use in the Chemical Weapons Convention and other treaties prohibiting and eliminating weapons. However, as with respect to the preamble, including threat in the operative portion of the Prohibition Treaty is important because of the centrality of nuclear deterrence to military postures and the need to undermine its legitimacy, as well as to help prevent specific threats leading to use. Including the prohibition of threat of use also helps make clear that members of the Prohibition Treaty may in no way cooperate with reliance on nuclear weapons. We have been living with a grotesque regime of nuclear threat since World War II. It would be strange indeed if the ban treaty did not address this reality. The fact that the UN Charter contains an obligation not to resort to threat of force does not change the picture. In time of armed conflict, which of course is the most likely time when a specific threat of use would be made, international humanitarian law is the primary body of law. A prohibition of threat of nuclear weapons in times of war and peace would in effect be specifications of the Charter and international humanitarian law. To the extent it is considered innovative with respect to IHL, it would be a very good innovation. There is no reason to think that including threat of use would in any way undermine the Charter or IHL. On the contrary, it would reinforce them. Thanks for your attention.
I thank Mr. John Burrows from Lawyers Committee on Nuclear Policy for his contribution. I give the floor to Mr. Daniel Santi from Sensatomica.
Distinguished delegates, I'm representing Sensatomica, a partner of ICANN. Sensatomica is one of the largest Italian grassroots movements for the abolishment of nuclear weapons, active in raising awareness in Italy on the moral and ethical imperative on nuclear disarmament. Madam President, we believe that these negotiations are the concretization of this intention, and that they are going to implement Article 6 of the NPT, which requires the pursuit of good faith negotiations leading to complete nuclear disarmament. To identify a common set of principles that each state can share and apply, it is essential that as many states as possible participate in these negotiations, even if not now, at least at the June-July session. That's what we hope for our country as well as all others who are not present this week. In Europe, there are around 150 nuclear weapons, of which 40 are on the Italian soil, with a mechanism commonly called nuclear sharing. The nuclear sharing mechanism was created before the entry into force of the NPT, and it has been considered compatible with the NPT itself. But the doubts regarding this point are many. For instance, the generalization of nuclear sharing-like mechanisms could allow to bypass the NPT in an alarming way. For these reasons, among others, we would like the treaty to include the prohibition of the installation, stockpiling of nuclear weapons outside of the country they belong to, and also the prohibition to host these weapons in non-nuclear armed states. For the same reasons, we would like the treaty to include the prohibition of the transfer and deployment of nuclear weapons or parts of them through non-nuclear armed states, territories, and/or means. This would be furthermore relevant if a nuclear armed state is using the Ban Treaty as the vehicle to eliminate its nuclear weapons, or if a state formally hosting weapons on a territory under its control is renouncing and removing those weapons. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank you very much. And the next speaker on today's list is Zia Mian. Wonderful timing, Zia, my friend, from Princeton University.
Thank you very much, Chair. I wanted to talk briefly about a slightly different perspective on some of the core prohibitions that have been discussed today. And the first observation I want to make is that the core prohibitions that you discuss today and in the subsequent meetings need to keep in mind that this will be the structure that will give guidance to the subsequent process of the elimination of nuclear weapons, no matter what that process happens to be or how long it takes. So you are shaping the architecture of what the elimination procedures and processes and requirements will eventually have to be. With that comes the realization that there are many possible worlds without nuclear weapons that we can imagine at the end of this process. And each of those worlds free of nuclear weapons, with the Prohibition Treaty in place, will have varying levels of resilience and robustness against the kind of tragic stresses and strains that mark the world as it is. And we can't wish those stresses and strains away. So one of the things that I would urge you to keep in mind is that always remember that we walked into the nuclear age 70 years ago, and it took the United States only a few years to make the first nuclear weapons without any prior experience or background in nuclear weapons technology or science. That fact is going to be true forever, that in the way the world is, states that choose to be that way will only ever be a few years away from nuclear weapons, regardless of a prohibition treaty, unless that prohibition treaty keeps that very firmly in its sights. The second connected fact is that the prohibition of actually existing nuclear weapons would be a historic achievement. But if tomorrow all of the weapon states said, okay, we agree with you, thank you, we will now abolish our nuclear weapons and dismantle them all, you will have vast stockpiles of nuclear weapons material in components and an existing structure of nuclear science and scientists and laboratories and experience to grapple with. Just remember this fact, that even though there are 15,000 nuclear weapons, there is already enough nuclear weapon usable material in the world for well over 100,000 weapons. And where will this figure in your prohibition treaty? You can't just leave it to elimination. You have to give guidance to the process of elimination now as to how to think about what happens with these weapon-usable materials. And keep in mind, a lot of this material is actually in civilian programs in nuclear weapon states. Britain, for example, has 100 tons of separated plutonium from its civilian program. But this is all weapon-usable material. So you have to grapple with this when you discuss the question of we need to respect the rights of states to have nuclear energy programs. What do you do about nuclear energy programs that include the production of weapon-usable materials? I also want to raise briefly this question of the threat of use of nuclear weapons. I was surprised to see that there was so much discussion about something that in other forums, non-weapon states have given great importance to the need for negative security assurances. And this is codified in many nuclear weapon-free zone treaties. And so the question you want to think about when you think about whether to prohibit the threat of use to nuclear weapons is that states which are parties to nuclear weapon-free zones are covered and protected from the threat of use of nuclear weapons by nuclear weapon states. What about countries that are not members of nuclear weapon-free zones? They are only protected from the threat of use by the fact that the weapon states choose to give them this assurance, not that it is binding under international law. So I think one of the things that you have to think about is whether you want to give equal protection to all states under this set of prohibitions, under all circumstances going forward. The other thing that's worth keeping in mind about the threat of use of nuclear weapons is that if you recall the advisory opinion of the International World Court in 1996, and people have cited Article 2, I would caution you to be more careful in the citation of Article 2 in this regard, because the court looked into this matter and it ruled unanimously on this question that the threat or use of force by means of nuclear weapons is contrary to Article 2, but also if that threat fails to meet the requirements of Article 51 of the Charter. Article 51, as I'm sure all of you know, deals with the right of states to self-defense. So what the World Court was telling us is that Article 2 protects you except in the circumstance of self-defense, where Article 51 applies. So you have to balance the obligations under Article 2 in the Charter with the obligation given under Article 51. And Article 51, as I'm sure you recall, is very clear. It says that nothing in this Charter shall impair the inherent right of self-defense. So if you're going to prohibit the use of nuclear weapons, then I would urge you to think about the threat of use of nuclear weapons in the context of Article 51, not just Article 2. And my last observation is going to be about the issue of universal jurisdiction. That if you're going to have a treaty that prohibits nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons-related activities from planning, testing, development, use, and so on, the question is, how will the treaty deal with this question of that suppose somebody does violate these prohibitions? It is clear under existing international law, to which many states have already accepted the obligation, that universal jurisdiction is actually an important element of international law and governance when it comes to grave crimes against the world community. The 1949 Geneva Conventions on the Laws of War, which at one level are a fundamentally humanitarian instrument because they govern the conduct of war, provides for universal jurisdiction for war crimes. And The vast majority of states have ratified that convention, and I would urge you to think about how to build in the obligation of states parties under the core prohibitions of this treaty to think about universal jurisdiction as a way to give the normative value of this treaty an actual operating structure that reaches out into the world in an enduring way. Thank you.
And the next speaker this afternoon is Dr. Joshua Torres Sandoval, Autonomous University of Baja. Joshua, you have the floor.
Tardes. Gracias, señora Presidente.
Thank you, Madam. The Autonomous University of Baja California is to train academics and civilians at the local, regional, and international levels. We want to offer a global vision involving participation in sustainable development at the global level, so that these people will be able to act responsibly and ethically in order to promote and apply and transfer knowledge so as to promote sustainable development. We do research on nuclear disarmament at international fora in order to contribute to the academic debate and to offer specific solutions. So our university participated in the Vienna Conference on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons. And there were also a number of side events earlier in Mexico in that connection. The meeting showed that nuclear weapons do not acknowledge borders, and they have a devastating effect on health and economic development, inter alia. And no state or organization could provide adequate assistance in the event of any kind of nuclear detonation. So our university expressed its great concern over this, and that 9 states had nuclear weapons, and the threat of the use of nuclear weapons is a violation of the Charter of the United Nations, international law, and international humanitarian law. Nuclear weapons threaten life and global development. The university is an educational institution which does some moral humanitarian work, and it promotes this idea of a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons. The university would offer an invitation along with all other organizations to promote education in order to develop a culture of peace in support of disarmament. Some of the research that we do has yielded some proposals. We talked about the possible impact in a cross-border area between a nuclear weapon state and a non-nuclear weapon state in the event of a detonation at the border. And it was clear that neighbors of nuclear weapon states were very vulnerable, despite any preventive provisions in force. And there were so we also looked at how one could possibly provide protection in border areas, and we found nothing. So there has to be a commitment so that nuclear weapon states do not attack non-nuclear weapon states or states along their borders. And this would involve an amendment to the NPT, Article 8 thereof, or it would require a specific international instrument about non-use of nuclear weapons in a nuclear weapon-free zone. We also had a proposal on protecting state security. The university supports the main goal of this conference, and our university is very grateful to the United Nations for inviting us to participate and represent academia. Peace is the most rational way of ensuring human safety, so working for peace is a universal task. Thank you very much.
Le agradezco al señor Joshua.
I'd like to thank Mr. Joshua Torres Sandoval of the Autonomous University of Baja for his contribution, and I call now on Mr. Kimyake Kawai from Soka Gakkai International.
Thank you, Madam President. I'm speaking on behalf of Soka Gakkai International, SGI, a Buddhist faith-based organization and an international partner of ICANN. Madam President, in recent years, the logic of deterrence has been challenged from a variety of perspectives, including the legal, the ethical, and the pragmatic. Faith traditions have contributed to this discourse. As Buddhists, we find valuable insight in these words of Shakyamuni. Look at those who fight, ready to kill. Fear arises from taking up arms and preparing to strike, unquote. This bears directly on the psychology of arms, violence, and security, exposing the unspoken logic of hostile confrontation. It appends the generally accepted logic of deterrence. Greater and more lethal armaments do not bring freedom from fear, but in fact amplify and deepen it, imprinting a sense of powerlessness and resignation in the face of the seeming inevitability of violence. Challenging the entrenched global pathology of fear and powerlessness is central to the work of this conference. Madam President, in this context, World Nuclear Weapon-Free Zones, NWFZs, represent a crucial source of legal and practical precedent for a treaty outlawing nuclear weapons. They also provide an invaluable body of learning and experience regarding the positive transformation of security thinking that disarmament brings. Many of the states within the NWFZs have made efforts to avoid presenting a military threat to their neighbors in order to create a region in which the citizens of all states can live free of the fear of such threats. Madam President, realizing the right of all people on Earth to live free from fear of nuclear destruction is the ultimate objective of this conference. This would be a fulfillment of commitment to universal human rights that has been central to the United Nations mission since its inception. Therefore, SGI encourages the conference to, 1, incorporate in the treaty text a recognition that nuclear weapons are unacceptable and must be prohibited and eliminated because of their inhumane nature. 2, declare that the treaty manifests the shared commitment of the world people that the suffering endured by the Hibakusha must never be repeated. SGI submitted to the conference a working paper which is available as working paper 8. I thank you, Madam President.
Le agradezco al señor.
I would like to thank Mr. Kawai of Soka Gakkai International for his statement. And now we have the last speaker, Ms. Anna Ikeda from Amplify Youth Network.
Madam President, thank you for giving me the floor. I am speaking on behalf of Amplify, a network of young people from every region of the globe actively working towards nuclear abolition. Young people are often overlooked in UN negotiations and decision-making processes, particularly in disarmament. However, we strongly believe that we are vital actors that these negotiations will benefit from, including the voices of youth from around the world. In order to move beyond the inertia too often present in nuclear disarmament, it will be important to bring in fresh ideas, new voices, and innovative approaches. Youth are innovators, and as digital natives, we are not only up to date with the changing world, we are the ones building it. Young people are designing how we all interact and how information is shared. Nuclear-armed countries squander vast resources to build, renew, and maintain nuclear weapons that could instead be utilized to strengthen education, economic development, and social institutions toward the 2030 agenda. Investing in the modernization of inhumane, indiscriminate, and cruel weapons instead of in services to citizens limits opportunities for new generations. Amplify believes that this treaty should prohibit the use, threat of use, possession, stockpiling, production, and trade of nuclear weapons, while also prohibiting assistance with any of those prohibited acts. These provisions would be the core of a treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons. Amplify encourages states to recognize that prohibiting assistance means also prohibiting investment. The inclusion of financing in the text will reinforce the scope and effect of the treaty and will reinforce the impact of efforts to reduce humanitarian harm through strengthened application of global norms and international law. In addition to the prohibitions, the treaty should contain operational paragraphs with positive obligations. As a youth network, Amplify places a high importance on disarmament education and risk education. All states parties to the future treaty should have an obligation to support disarmament education globally and to support any risk education that may be needed to ensure that persons living in and near areas made dangerous by nuclear weapons or nuclear detonations have the tools they need to stay safe. We also call on states to include rights-based, age and gender-sensitive victim assistance provisions in the operational paragraphs of the treaty. Finally, Madam President, looking toward the future, we believe that the results of these negotiations will only be successful and sustainable if we engage youth who are now or will one day be decision makers and government leaders. It is necessary that youth are involved now so that the world will never repeat the mistake of producing, threatening, or using nuclear weapons. I thank you, Madam President.
Le doy las gracias a la señora.
I would like to thank Ms. Anna Ikeda from Amplify Youth Network. She was the last on our list of speakers from civil society. Now we have to consider how to organize tomorrow, now that we've had 2 very fruitful days of substantive discussion with specific proposals made, and delegations have really tried hard to deal specifically with the points that we suggested. And this should help us to elaborate all of these proposals into a text. So we've made real progress, I think. And many delegations wanted to have an opportunity to have an interactive dialogue. And so we're trying to organize it so that tomorrow we can have an interactive dialogue in the morning and in the afternoon, so we can have exchanges on the different concepts that have been put forward in these past 2 days. So we'd like to have 2 presenters or panelists and get a kind of balance to encourage interactive dialogue, and then the floor would be opened up so we could have interaction and have all delegations participate. So we would have an interactive dialogue on the elements for the preamble and the objectives, the purposes, and then after that we would have an interactive dialogue on core prohibitions. So we could discuss all of the different elements and ideas that have been put forward. And of course this would be helpful to the presidency to see the linkages among the various approaches being advocated so that we can see what to incorporate. So what I suggest is that on Friday morning, the conference would begin consideration of topic 3 on institutional arrangements. And then after that, we would have the report of the Credentials Committee. That's item 7. And then we'd move on to item 5, which would be organisation of work for the second part of our substantive session in June. So we'd look at how we can move ahead in the intersessional period and how we would arrange the work for June. So if you all agree with this approach, we will proceed in that way, and tomorrow we'll have interactive dialogues. And you can think about it, but we don't want to have speeches. We want to have a more spontaneous discussion among you all. So if you all agree, then there's a question from the Holy See.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, this delegation sought earlier this afternoon to inscribe, to speak in the second day allotted to the discussion that we are presently engaged in. It seems to me quite reasonable to engage in large measure in the type of discussion, open-ended, that you have proposed, but I trust that it may still be possible for our delegation to make a statement, and I would see if I could make that oriented toward a participation in the interactive dialogue that you proposed. Nevertheless, I would trust that we might be able to be given the opportunity to make a statement. Thank you, Madam President.
Quisiera consultarle a la...
Thank you. Could I ask the representative of the Holy See if he's ready with his statement, because this would be a good time for him to make his statement. We didn't actually have you on the list, but if you're ready to speak now, then I think this would be the right time, and we could listen to your statement now. The Holy See has the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. I regret that I am not in a position to tell you that our delegation has its statement ready for presentation at this time.
Esperaremos entonces mañana.
Well then, tomorrow we'll hear the presentation by your delegation. So if you all agree, then we will adjourn this meeting and meet tomorrow at 10 a.m. Thank you very much. This meeting stands adjourned.
Nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices. The same sort of prohibition shall apply to the production, possession, acquisition,
transfer and stockpiling of any amount of fissile materials for use in nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices. Prohibition should also cover construction of any nuclear weapon-related installations. Moreover, it shall prohibit any kind of direct or indirect cooperation in or assistance to or encouragement or inducement of any activity prohibited under the Convention or incompatible with its object and purpose or the general objective of a nuclear weapon-free world. It should set a clear and unextendable deadline for the total elimination of nuclear weapons, complete destruction of all weapon-grade fissile material, or their conversion to material usable for peaceful purposes, and the total destruction of nuclear weapon-related facilities, or, if feasible, their conversion to uses not incompatible with the provisions and objects of and purpose of the instrument. Likewise, it has to establish a robust international verification mechanism to ensure compliance of its parties with their obligations thereunder, and also ensure the principle of irreversibility. Finally, Madam President, it shall in no way affect the fullest possible realization of the inalienable right of states to develop, research, production, and use of nuclear
obligations under Article 4 as earlier stated. With regard to core prohibitions of the treaty, the fulcrum should include the prohibition of its parties, their nationals, and any other individual subject to its jurisdiction from engaging in any activity related to the use, development, production, stockpiling, transfer, acquisition, deployment, testing, and financing of nuclear weapons, as well as assistance with these acts under any circumstance. It should also provide a framework for the elimination of nuclear weapons within agreed time frames for those states with nuclear weapons that will become states parties. The treaty should also prohibit state parties from allowing nuclear weapons to be stationed on a territory under their control. The treaty should prohibit the assistance, encouragement, or inducement of any nuclear weapon-related activities, including specifically through financing. The treaty should prohibit the transit and transshipment of nuclear weapons through the territories of state parties. The text should be precise, concise, simple, and unambiguous. Finally, the treaty should have provisions for verification measures that will ensure the effective maintenance of a nuclear-free world and to achieve nuclear disarmament. The verification measures should extend to elimination of nuclear weapons. In other words, the treaty should provide for the time-bound, transparent, verifiable, and irreversible elimination of nuclear weapons. I thank you, Madam President.
Le agradezco al distinguido.
I thank the distinguished representative of Nigeria for his statement. The representative of Egypt has the floor.
To nuclear weapon haves and have-nots. It is also discriminatory as it has a robust mechanism for the verification of compliance of non-nuclear weapon states with their obligations under the treaty, but lacks any mechanism to verify the compliance of nuclear weapon states with their nuclear disarmament obligations. Implementation of prohibitions contained in the future instrument and the elimination of nuclear weapons related fissile material, and nuclear weapon construction facilities should be time-bound. We should seriously avoid leaving the implementation of such important provisions for an unseeable future, as it is in the case of Article 6 of the NPT. Such an instrument in no way should legitimize the existence of nuclear weapons or their continued possession. Its text should be clear, precise, and resistant against abuse and any interpretation contrary to its object and purpose and the general objective of a world without nuclear weapons. It should unambiguously and categorically prohibit forever, without exception and under any circumstances whatsoever, research on and the development, testing, production, possession, acquisition, transfer, receipt, storage, installation, deployment, stockpiling, modernizing, qualitative improvement, and use or threat of use of all types of energy for peaceful purposes without discrimination. And I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the distinguished delegate of Iran for his intervention. I give the floor to the delegation of Nigeria.
Thank you, Madam President, for giving us the floor. As my delegation has steadfastly maintained, the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of the use of nuclear weapons make it unacceptable for such weapons to exist in human societies. Pursuant to the obligations as contained in Article 6 of the NPT to pursue negotiations in good faith on effective measures leading to the cessation of the nuclear arms race at an early date and to nuclear disarmament, the world has been waiting for 47 years without any appreciable progress made with regard to this obligation. Nuclear weapons are not for fun. They are for use. Their manufacture and stockpiling are a pointer to an intendment to use them. And in fact, they have been used in the past, and the world saw the devastating effect of their use, not only to humans, but to the ecosystem. My delegation agrees with the position of other delegations on the necessity of a legally binding international instrument that prohibits nuclear weapons. Their prohibition has the potential to codify their illegality, stigmatize their possession, and facilitate their eventual elimination. This delegation also agrees that banning of nuclear weapons will put the weapons on same footing as the other recognized weapons of mass destruction, such as biological and chemical weapons. A treaty banning nuclear weapons should build on existing norms and reinforce existing legal instruments, notably
Se declara abierta la...
Good afternoon. The 6th plenary meeting of the substantive session of the United Nations Conference to negotiate a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons leading towards their total elimination is called to order.
La conferencia proseguirá ahora.
The conference will now continue its consideration of topic 2, core prohibitions, effective legal measures, legal provisions and norms under agenda item 8B. And we are currently having an exchange of views and hearing countries' views about what they feel should be the content of the treaty's provisions. So continuing with the list of speakers, I call first on the delegation of Iran.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, we believe that the scope of the instrument and the prohibitions should be as comprehensive as possible. It should complement all existing international legally binding instruments governing nuclear weapons. Moreover, it should have no loophole as exists, for instance, in the CTBT for such cases as the subcritical or similar experiments. Equally, contrary to such a discriminatory treaty as the NPT, it must be non-discriminatory. We have to avoid developing again an NPT-like discriminatory treaty that divides its parties